This is Sandra, known as Sandy Hemme. Sandy has spent the past 43 years in prison for a crime she did not commit. In fact, for the longest time, there was actually speculation about a police officer who most likely committed the crime instead. Joining me today for an analysis of this case is a former Maryland State police officer and FBI instructor with extensive experience providing expert testimony in a variety of different cases. We're going to talk openly about some different topics with my guest speaker today, like good cops, bad cops, and justice reformation, because let's face it, based on previous cases we just covered, such as the case of Lauren Johansson, where the judge released the perpetrator, her abuser, on bond before he went out and murdered her. And then we recently just covered the troubling situation of Sandra Birchmore, a 15-year-old who was manipulated and abused by her police instructor at the academy, who is now facing charges for her murder. Additionally, we will consider the case of Sandra Hemme, who endured 43 years of wrongful imprisonment for a crime that she did not commit, likely as the result of police misconduct. Moral of today's video, there's a need for change in our system. But first, let's review the details of the crime where an innocent woman, Sandra Hemme, paid dearly with many years of her life behind bars. In this case, the victim's name was Patricia Jeske, and she was an American woman just 31 years old, murdered in St. Joseph, Missouri on November 12th of 1980. When she failed to show up to her secretarial job at St. Joseph, Missouri Library, the library director, Dorothy Elliott, personally went to Patricia's home to check on Patricia, but was unsuccessful in making any contact with Patricia. Patricia's door was locked, and nobody was answering when she knocked. Helen McLaughlin, Patricia's mother, broke a window to enter the house, and there she made a chilling discovery once she was inside the home. Her daughter had died, but brutally. Sometime between the time of 5 p.m. on November 12, 1980, which was Patricia's last sighting alive, and the discovery of her body by her mother at 1 p.m. the following day, on November 13th of 1980, Patricia had been SA'd, and she was laying naked as a phone cord was wrapped around her neck and a laceration was on the back of her head. The death was ruled as strangulation with multiple head injuries. By December 5th, a man named Joseph Patrick Wobski and Sandra Lynn Hemme were arrested for this crime that was done to Patricia. Now, Joseph originally was charged for the crime itself, and Sandy was charged for a Class D felony in having knowledge of this crime when she gave a lot of mixed signals and confessions of knowing about this crime and the man named Joseph. However, the charges against Joseph were eventually dropped after he was able to provide a solid alibi for the time that Patricia was killed. Sandy, was then charged on December 10th and denied bail. Now this gets wild, okay? Sandy was just 20 years old at the time of her conviction, had this history of needing mental health assistance, like she was mentally ill. During the time that this crime was committed, she was in the middle of having a mental breakdown. Literally, she was booked up in a hospital receiving assistance. So the police go to the hospital and they ended up collecting several different confessions from her. During these times of interrogation, Sandy was checked in as a patient at the hospital of St. Joseph's State Hospital, laying in a hospital bed. Okay, she's not mentally well, trying to get better, receiving treatment for auditory hallucinations, derealization, and her drug issues. She was sedated at the time that the police continued to coerce her into making false statements to fit their narrative of the crime that had happened to the victim, Patricia. Authorities used what's called coercive circumstances, where a person is essentially forced to be in a situation under someone else's control. This is the use of intimidation to get what they wanted from a victim of circumstance. In this case, police ended up conducting hours-long interviews with Sandy while she was actually in the hospital, laying in the bed. At some points, Sandy was so heavily medicated that she was unable to even hold her head up and was restrained and strapped to the chair or the bedding that she was in. Over the course of these coercive interrogations, Sandy's statements conflicted with the known facts of the case and were internally inconsistent. The jury never heard about the profoundly coercive circumstances under which police obtained her statements. Those statements were only evidence against her at her trial. The jury never heard about the crime scene evidence that supported Sandy's innocence. There was no physical, forensic, or eyewitness evidence that linked her to the victim or the crime scene. Sadly, everything was just based off of confessions from a very sedated woman with a mental illness within a hospital at the time. And it's so interesting because what ends up happening is it ends up looking like a police officer within that case framed Sandy. And there were things that he did after she had been locked up that got him in trouble with the law, but unfortunately, he was never able to be held accountable for what he did to Sandy. And we're going to talk about that alongside a few other topics from Shannon, former Maryland State Police officer and FBI instructor, to further discuss this case and what came about the circumstances for the injustice that was brought on to Sandra.
You were just a baby. Mom sent me a picture of you. I'm a little bigger than you.
She won't be eligible for Social Security ever.
We're going to dive a little bit into what happens when innocent people actually end up incarcerated and what that looks like from Shannon's perspective. We're just going to bounce some ideas and topics around, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this case. So welcome, Shannon. You've served 27 years for the Maryland State Police. Following retirement, you taught at an FBI academy. We're going to get into that in a moment, but what happens in the case from here? Can you, a former police officer and FBI instructor, talk to me about what happened here? Why police did this to Sandra? Police are the good guys. Like, they're the honest representatives of authority and our protectors. So what happened here?
I don't think this case is unique in that it was a bad outcome.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that the majority of police officers are good, honest officers and work hard to keep us safe. In this particular case, I'm pretty sure, it was never had a trial for it, that a police officer actually committed the crime. And because of the reporting where they found jewelry from the woman, the deceased, in his home, and he was using the credit cards of hers the very next day, it's obvious that they knew that he did it, in my mind. I do think that the police knew this, and how many officers knew it and how much they knew is up to speculation. But they used a false confession to try and convict her. And if somebody walks into a police station and confesses, you can charge them with that. To try them to have guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not all doubt, you need corroborating evidence. And there was none for her. In fact, there was evidence to say that her confession was false because of the other people that she confessed to. Now, she's not the only mentally challenged person to ever be convicted of a crime they didn't commit. But in this case, it would appear that they did this to cover up the fact that the officer was involved. Now, the officer left the department shortly thereafter, and he was charged with other crimes later. In fact, he passed away in jail, I believe it was 2015.
For other crimes that caught up with him.
Right. The issue that's rarely brought up is the people that are still around. What's their responsibility for this? Is there any responsibility at all for them? If you give false testimony, if you lie, there's usually a time limit for to be charged with that. In other words, that crime has a life expectancy of usually 5 years or something for perjury. Okay. Well, 5 years is gone. I hate to say that's the way it is, but that's the way it is. The other cases that you see like that, you see a common thread where people are either badgered into confession, juveniles especially, and after the confession they often say, "Can I go home now?" thinking because the police told them, "If you tell us what happened, we'll let you go home." And yet, it's still a problem. There was a professor at John Jay College, and I don't remember his name, who was an expert on this. And he talked about the Central Park Five in New York. They were convicted of molesting that woman, the victim. He pointed out that each confession said, "I was there," but nobody took responsibility for the act, which should have said something to the officers getting the confession. Of course, they were all freed later, but that's a lot to go through for something that you didn't do. Questions our judicial system. If you believe in democracy, the judicial system is something that you want to uphold as being fair and equitable, that we're all treated equally. And that's what cases like this do. They put a doubt in the system.
Right, and you were saying that for the most part we can trust police because for 100% of the part we should be able to trust authority. But seeing as to how you have a lot of experience, have you actually for yourself seen that this is a common thing where unfortunately officers will cover for one another?
Let me start by saying there's over 900,000 police officers in this country. And I want to say it's over 700,000 full-time. There's a lot of part-time and federal officers also. And there's over 18,000 police agencies. So if you have that many people with that many departments, you're bound to have a few people that shouldn't have the uniform on. It's not unlike having a professional, whether it's a finance person or a medical professional or something that does something wrong. But again, going back to what you said and emphasizing in a democracy, you expect to be treated equally by the government. I do believe that it's a minority of the officers that repeat these incidents over and over again. And I think also that many of them have such a history that they shouldn't be allowed to go that far to the incident. Right. But police are reluctant to criticize their own, very reluctant, especially for minor stuff. Major stuff, it's a different story. But in this country, we have laws to protect whistleblowers because whistleblowers are supposed to tell us the truth, but we have to have laws to protect them, which seems strange in a way. It's an issue that I never knew the depth of it until the last couple of years. I always knew that we had people incarcerated that shouldn't be incarcerated, but you believe they are rare and you think of it as a common mistake. Humans are humans, and it can sometimes be hard to be human. But in some cases, the officers, not just the officers, but the prosecutors, they're so focused on convicting somebody that they don't look in another direction. I equate it to somebody driving to an appointment, and they're lost and they're not sure where to go, so they just go faster because they don't want to be late. And that's what happens with many of these cases. They actually put blinders on and ignore other evidence. In the case you talked about, exculpatory evidence is evidence that would show that the person maybe didn't commit the crime. It's good for the person charged. Mm-hmm. And in this case, exculpatory evidence of the jewelry and the credit card should have been entered into trial. And on top of it, they had to have somebody else testify because they wouldn't convict her on a confession alone. So you figure that there's probably some false testimony there. Maybe it's the fact that she was mentally ill and they just thought it doesn't matter. But that's sad to think about it.
Very,
and
yeah.
You know there had to be several people involved in it.
And it makes you wonder how far that went. Was it just the police officers kind of bringing it to the judge's attention? The judge just bought what was told, or did it go further? Because sometimes, I'm not trying to make our judicial system bad, but since we're on this topic of reformation, sometimes you hear about judges being paid off, like it's an idea in existence that you would be able to take it that far. Like if a celebrity has to face something and the judge is trying the case or whatever. Now, I know that's a little bit off topic here, but I was just throwing that out because these are headlines. These are things that I think that people are truly interested in, or they have it planted in their minds like, yeah, that's a thing.
I think it's related to the topic. Yes, I do. I don't know how frequent it occurs, like false convictions.
Yeah.
But you know it does. There was a couple cases like that for a juvenile authority in Pennsylvania a couple years back where the judge and the prosecutors were all in cahoots together. It just leaves a bad taste in your mouth as far as the justice system. When you lock up the innocent person, the guilty person is still out there, allowed to commit more crimes. It's something that needs to be addressed. We always look at police reform, but we don't look at judicial reform, the whole system. And I think it should be. I've always said if you have the authority, you have to have the responsibility with it. And we don't hold these people responsible. When we get these innocent people out of jail, nobody goes back, like in this case, to say, well, who did this and what consequences should there be for them? I know that happens, but it's very rare.
Going back into how to fix this, we were talking about a police officer in the last conversation that we had that ended up abducting this minor that he had this fascination, obsession with. And he took her miles and miles away after he unfortunately killed her family. And then they ended up pulling her over, and they said that she jumped out of the car. And actually, I think he killed himself, but they ended up like looking into his record. And it turned out that that was what shocked everybody the most, was how did this guy end up actually getting the job in the first place? Sometimes people don't deserve to represent the badge, wear the uniform and do the job because of simply who they are. It's just not a fit.
I think when you're talking specifically about police officers that demonstrate poor behavior or criminal behavior even, you should look at their background and determine how they got there. I don't think an officer with 20 years on that does something heinous, commits a crime, it would be rare for me to think that's their first incident. When George Floyd died, Chauvin was tried and convicted for his death for kneeling on him for over 9 minutes. And it was reported that he had, I think it was 17 or 18 complaints. I know 2 were found to be justified, and he got a reprimand for them or whatever. He also got some commendations. When the federal people were trying Chauvin for the civil rights violation, they looked into his background, and they found that in 2017, I think, he was charged or found to be guilty of kneeling on a 14-year-old's back and neck, to where the 14-year-old was saying, "I can't breathe," sound familiar? And the 14-year-old passed out. So the federal people wanted to bring that into court with this case, and the judge apparently said, no, you can't do that. And they were even thinking of trying him with that as a civil rights violation, as another count with George Floyd. That incident, I can only assume, was one of the 2 reprimands. And that should not be a reprimand. That should be a more serious violation of police work. In fact, if a neighbor did that to a neighbor citizen, they would probably be arrested. Not just that, but how many other complaints, how many other times did he do that and you don't know about? Or how many times did he cross the line in these other complaints, but the people wouldn't testify against him, so they were dismissed? There's oftentimes a history there. In our previous discussion, I talked about an officer that actually shot and killed a man. I was consulted on that case, and I had access to his personnel file. Mm-hmm. Well, he had been on the job, I want to say 11 years when this happened. And looking at his file, you say he should have been fired a long time ago. In fact, he probably shouldn't have been hired. I think the responsibility should go along with the authority with the department in supervision and hiring and training. I think it has to be woven into the system. If you're a prosecutor and you know that somebody by recent evidence has been not found, but the evidence against them has been thrown out, whether it's DNA or whatever or something, oftentimes the courts will say, well, what we should do is retry this case. So the prosecutor will leave that person incarcerated for several years, in one instance I know of, and then 2 years later released them. They had no evidence. This is an issue for the boards, the legal boards and stuff in the states. In other words, they should be working with the legislature to clean up their own act as far as that's concerned. It's not uncommon talking to a lawyer for them to tell you about a poor lawyer experience they've experienced with another lawyer. Mm-hmm. In a courtroom or a case or whatever. So it is universal, but until we want to clean it up, it's not going to happen.
What would that look like? What does that take?
Well, I think to shine a light on it is the start. There are numerous innocent programs around the country, and they have done a very good job of shining a light in the right direction, you might say. When you're incarcerated and you're the average person in this country, you don't have unlimited funds for investigators and for lawyers and stuff like that. They have brought these cases out and worked so well. Now, we don't know how many cases they've worked on that there wasn't enough evidence, and we don't know how many cases they can't take because they have limited resources. Looking at this from that perspective, you can understand why people would say we should fund these innocent programs more. The innocent people in jail are not the problem. They're a symptom of the problem. The problem is how they got there. Until we tide that or change that direction, we'll continue to take these innocent people out of jail. And those are only the ones we know of.
A lot of people look at the aftermath of what's happening after a crime, and a lot of people's frame of mind goes to execute him, the death penalty, make them pay. It's a lot of times pressed into the aftermath, and a lot of people, I don't think, go back to that starting, the beginning, to see how this even happened, which is why I love that you're on my channel specifically, because that's actually something that we focus on. We focus on patterns and the beginning stages of something that happens happens that actually forms into something really bad that happens.
I think it has to be looked at that way. If we have airplane accidents, industrial accidents, traffic accidents, anything that causes loss of life, injury, or loss of property in large ways, we tend to do an investigation because we want to find out how not to repeat that. But you don't hear about these investigations with all the innocent people. There was a man in Louisiana who was released from death row, and I'm not sure how long he was on death row, but he was the 8th person in that state to be released since 1973. And at that time, there had been, I think it was over 150 people since 1973 to be released from death row. There was an article about they've reached the number of 200 people that have been released from death row. Now, it's not your sentence is commuted. It's not that they're going to give you time served or anything. I'm talking about people that the courts have said they did not commit this crime.
Yeah.
So when you have 200 people, I'm sure someone would argue, well, this is since 1973. That's a long... Doesn't matter if it's one person. We should look at it that way. And we should look at it as, is this a matter of poor police work, overzealous prosecutors, not willing to look at the other evidence? Is it a matter of corrupt judges, like you say? You want to look at the system in order to correct the system. If you don't correct it, we could be funding these innocent programs forever and ever and still have innocent people incarcerated. Some of these people, they're in jail a long time. I mean, 25, 30, 35 years. You put that to yourself if you think about yourself being in that situation. I don't know if I would survive. You don't think about it until you start doing the research. And then you find this and you say, oh my God, I thought it was a rare thing. It's not as rare as I thought it was.
And I feel that that is because when things make headlines, this one's not the one. This isn't something that actually is called to people's attention. It's usually about the crime that's been committed and the person that's being convicted. Everybody kind of looks forward to that aftermath of, well, what's going to happen to the bad guy?
I think the more awareness that we have about this, you talk about being interested in crime shows, and there are crime shows plentiful. I mean, they're out there. And at the same time, from time to time, you see crime shows about somebody being released from jail that's innocent.
From time to time. That's the thing. From time to time, yeah. So like a rare thing, like, whoa, didn't see that coming, yeah.
And in order to make a dent in that, to make it worthy, I'm hoping that's what the book does, that people look at the book and say, maybe we could use reform here and use some reform here. In the police agencies itself, I think that having an excellent background check and then excellent training and then supervision goes a long way for an investment, because what you're doing is you're hiring somebody for 20, 25, 30 years or more. So you want to make sure the product's the best you have. And then when there's a consequence of not having the best product, and there's some strict consequences with it, that would change behavior. I really think that when we look at reforming police, we look at the direction of what exists now. The example I often use is you're taking apples out of the barrel and then separating the good apples from the bad apples and then putting the good apples back in. Well, the whole way to look at this in a different way is not to allow the bad apples in to begin with.
Right.
Now, certainly you could hire somebody that does a great job and they're trained well, they do a good job, and then 10 or 15 years something happens and they snap, they break, whatever. That does happen in every profession in every society. But you can eliminate a lot of the poor behavior by your selection process and your training and supervision. And that, if you look around the country, you see different departments that have different problems like that. I think administrators do it because they look at it like that's their job, to fill all the spots.
Even if there's something on their record? Like, even if they're, I mean, because to my understanding, they do an extensive background check on people that take that position. Would there be some way that wouldn't pop up, or? I
can't say.
Okay.
The recent case of the shooting of a woman in Illinois.
With the police officer. We're talking about the woman that had the hot boiling pot of water. Yeah.
Sheriff's Office.
The just-released body camera video shows Deputy Sean Grayson and his partner responding to Sonia Massey's house in Springfield, Illinois, after she reported a prowler. Massey, at times, struggling to answer questions.
What is your last name? Shouldn't have to think about your last name.
Then, when deputies say she can remove a pot of boiling water from the stove, the situation changes in an instant.
Away from your hot steaming water.
Away from the hot steaming water?
Yeah.
Oh, I would rebuke you in the name of Jesus.
Huh?
Rebuke you in the name of
You better not. I swear to God, I'll shoot you right in your face.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Drop the pot! Drop the pot!
And
that was rough.
We don't
Yeah.
know everything about this officer. We know he's charged with this crime. We know he was discharged from the military for poor behavior. We don't know what the poor behavior is. It may be related to his DWIs that he had. But to work for 6 different departments in 4 years, it makes me think that they're not really conducting a background check to the extent that they should. And I know from experience with working with some agencies, if they have a poor officer, it's not uncommon for them to say, you need to leave, and if you don't, this is what's going to happen. So then they resign on their own. Well, once they resign on their own, they go to another agency, and if they get the personnel file from the previous agency, there's nothing there.
Wow,
it is a
okay.
responsibility.
And speaking of your knowledge and your experience in the field, you wrote this book, and I have my copy. The only thing I'm missing is your autograph. It's called Judicial Soup, One Man's Wrongful Conviction and What It Means for Criminal Justice Reform.
Well, first let me say that I had written some different articles in the law enforcement community, and I never advertised as an expert witness, but attorneys would look for a search, I guess, engine and find these articles and say, we'll hire you. So I was hired as his expert witness. And when I first took the case is about an ICE officer, a federal police officer. He's been on the job 19 years. And he was out with his girlfriend and 2 other couples, and they had dinner. And then they, walking down, this is an historic Georgetown area in Washington, D.C., and they decide to stop at another establishment for a nightcap and continue their conversation. They're there for an hour and a half. They order 2 rounds of drinks. 2 drinks are spilled, 1 served with a bug in it, and 2 drinks have the wrong mix. So his girlfriend at the time says, you need to pay the tab, we need to leave, it's close to midnight now. And one couple there came up from the south, used to work with the girlfriend, and they had an early flight. So Heath Thomas, he's the protagonist, he goes to the bar to pay the bill, and they're sort of ignoring him. And he sees a man at a wait station who he believes is the manager. So he goes to talk to the manager, and he says to him first in English, are you the manager? And the man said yes. And because the man looked of Spanish descent, Heath said to him, do you speak Spanish? And he said yes. So Heath proceeds to explain to him in Spanish about the problems with the service, and now he can't pay the bill. The manager responds with a comment, something akin, if you don't like it, I'll call the police. And Heath just explodes for about 2 seconds. It says, I am the effing police.
Yeah, I remember reading
the,
about that.
Yeah, he goes back to the bar, and at that time he's hit from the rear, as he describes it, and a bouncer picks him up, grabs him around the waist, locks his arms down, picks him up, carries him outside, and deposits him close to the street. And while he's being carried out, he has a gun in his waistband, and he feels the gun being dislodged. So as soon as he's released, he reaches for the gun. The bouncer, who is still looking over his shoulder, grabs the gun with his left hand and his waist with the right hand. And there's a fight for the weapon. The bouncer's testimony is that he went down the steps outside, stopped, set him down, backed up 3 feet, and then he turned with gun in hand and he reached out and grabbed it before it could be pointed at him. Every witness that's there said that this happened in the street or on the curb next to the street, not at the bottom of the steps. And nobody saw exactly what happened. It all took place in a nanosecond. However, there was a witness that testified for the prosecution that said he followed the bouncer out, and he saw this happen. Now, he said it happened in the street also. And he used the same wording that the bouncer used. The problem with this witness was he didn't follow the bouncer out. The bouncer was carrying Heath, followed by the bar manager, followed by Carol, Heath's girlfriend. So if he was in line, he was last in line. And there was testimony by the manager that said Heath and his girlfriend got there at 5 p.m. They didn't get there till after 11 or 10:17, something like that. There was just a whole lot of conflicts that should not have been allowed in court. The judge in this case prohibited evidence from being submitted which could have exonerated Heath, in my mind. He also prohibited me from testifying until after Heath testifies. Well, if you're the alleged guilty party, if you're the one that's charged with the crime, you don't have to testify. So I thought to myself, well, if Heath can't testify, does that mean I can't testify if he doesn't testify? You know, and I've never run into that. Then the judge actually put parameters on my testimony, what I could testify to. One of which is I could not testify to anything until after the gun was out. Well, how the gun came out is the case. I think the judge and the prosecutors believed that Heath's holster was defective, that he should have had a better holster, that it shouldn't have come out. And I can tell you as a training officer, that happens more than people think. That the gun can't be so secure that you can't get it out. When you need to draw the gun, you need to draw it. And even before the trial started, before he was indicted, the grand jury, they took this to 3 different grand juries over a period of 7 months, which I had never heard of before. And maybe that's common in D.C. In a federal case, anything that has a sentence that could be more than a year has to go to a grand jury. So it had to go to a grand jury. But there was never a complete investigation by the police, nor the prosecutor, nor the grand jury. It's like they had a story that the bar told them, and that's what they tried to prove, and left everything else out. Even the appellate court, after he was found guilty and he appealed, said there was a problem that this expert witness should have been allowed to testify. But then the appellate court goes on to say his testimony would not have changed the results. Well, they don't even know what I would have testified to. There was demonstrations in the courtroom where the defense attorney had a plastic gun in his hand using the actual bouncer and said, I want you to grab the gun when I turn. And he couldn't do it. People testified in court that Heath was picked up around the shoulders. And I think that was because they believed that the bouncer could feel the gun when he's carrying him out. Well, if it was around the shoulders, he couldn't. The problem is you can't pick somebody up around the shoulders. Overall, there were so many mistakes and errors, and so many of them were minor, but added together, they took the court in the wrong direction. And I do believe, and this is just a belief of mine, that the judge early on believed Heath was guilty and conducted the trial to fit that scenario. I don't believe the judge is corrupt or anything, but he didn't take in these conflicts, these differences that were obvious. We all see things a little different. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about that, where you can have 2 people witness the same crime and see different things. But some of the stuff in this case was just out and outright false. An excellent example is that the manager said that Heath was trying to fight with him. And he said he was disrupting the bar, and he even tried to fight with the bouncer. Well, he said this in the grand jury. At the trial, he said he didn't see what happened. So the defense attorney challenged the judge to say this witness should be impeached because what he said in the grand jury was not what he said at the trial. And it was an obvious difference. And the judge he ignored it. It went over his head. I don't know. He just kept on going. Now, when the bouncer testified, he didn't testify that Heath tried to fight with him. In fact, the defense attorney asked him, did you see Heath engaged in aggressive behavior with anybody? Were they fighting? Were they doing this or that? And he said, no. He said, what did you see? He said he was sort of like arguing with the manager, but it was in Spanish. I couldn't understand what they were saying. He said, what was your understanding? He says, it was like he was trying to explain something. Now, the court heard that, but it didn't fit because it didn't fit with what they believed happened. That's my mind. After this case was over, Heath and I talked by phone a lot, and I had written a number of articles, never a book, and I was going to write an article about this case. Hopefully it would get some attention from an attorney or something. Well, you couldn't do it. It was just, there was 8 days of trial, plus 10 days of 10 people testifying as a grand jury. So I decided to write a book about it. And in writing the book, I wanted similar incidents to weave into the story. In other words, like if something happened in this part of the book, I wanted to find a similar incident. And when I did that, it just read really poor. So what I did is I used these cases that I found to summarize in the back of each chapter. All except one chapter has a case in the back of it. And the cases are just 1 page. But the reader will draw similarities between Heath's case and many of these cases. They'll say, yeah, they determined that Heath was guilty right away. When the police were called to investigate it, and they interviewed everybody, Heath's girlfriend approached an officer and said, do you want to hear my case? I'm his girlfriend. So the officer said, yeah. And he said, did you see the gun come out? And she said, no. And then he turned around and left. He didn't want to hear anything that didn't fit with what he believed occurred. So that's how the book came about. Conducting the research about these bad cases, I never realized how many there were. he has extensive background, and if he can be arrested for something he didn't do, and then knowing his way around the system, and then be convicted, what happens to the John citizen who gets locked up? In talking with an attorney in D.C. that I was doing some work for, him and another attorney created a construction company just to hire people that they represented that they believed didn't commit a crime, but yet they pled guilty to it because they didn't want to miss work. And of course then years later you're trying to get a job someplace and they say, well, you have this crime in your background. Well, I didn't really do that. I just took a plea because I didn't want to lose time at work.
Right.
So if we have these major crimes that have that many false convictions, how many minor crimes do we have?
When somebody actually has to do time for something that they're not guilty for. With Sandra, she spent all this time in prison for a crime that she did not commit, and then she ended up having to rely on the Innocence Project to assist her, to help her get her voice out there. So is there anything that you want to add about the Innocence Project?
I think without the Innocence Projects, and there's a number of them around the country, we would not have any idea how the extent of the problem. I'm sure they've taken on cases that they didn't find innocence, and I'm sure they've taken on cases where people were guilty and just fooled them into it because they found something else that may happen. But just like when I testified as an expert witness, most of the times when I was called, I never testified. I never took the case. If I could testify against an officer or for an officer, but I could also testify the other way depending on the circumstances, that's what I would have to say. If I was given a deposition or sworn in as a trial testimony, I would have to give both sides of it.
On that topic right there about the Innocence Project potentially taking on cases that they may not be innocent. Like, for example, they're taking on Scott Peterson's case right now. Does the Innocence Project ever get it wrong?
They're human, so
Yeah.
I'm sure they do. I do believe he is guilty, but I don't have the evidence in front of me. When the crime occurred, because my wife is not unlike yourself, she likes to watch the true crime stories. She gets mad at me when I point out who did the crime early on. With Scott Peterson, she says, "What do you think?" And I said, "He's guilty." And she said, "Why?" And I said, she had I don't know what kind of car it was, and several days after she was missing, he sold the car. And she says, "Well, why does that make him guilty?" I said, "Well, he knew she wasn't coming back, you know."
Totally.
You know, if I left for a week and came home and I had a vehicle and my wife sold it, I would be questioning, like, what's going on? Now, that's not evidence that you could say that proves that he's guilty. It's just in my mind, that's the way I take it, that his actions knew that she wasn't coming back. Yeah, we don't know how many cases they start and they never complete. In other words, they never come to an innocence conclusion. We don't know those cases. We only know the cases they're successful in. There is funding for some of these innocent programs, and some states have started their own. North Carolina has a state commission for innocence programs. One of the cases that I know they worked, the man was in jail for 30 years, and they wanted to look at DNA evidence. It was a rape case, but the rape kit had been lost. Mm-hmm. So they just settled and left. Other evidence included 42 or 43 fingerprints. And it turns out the defendant's attorney later asked for that evidence, what they found, and then discovered that none of these fingerprints fit the defendant. After the evidence was found, then it was never used to begin with. In other words, nobody ever brought these fingerprints up at trial, which is exculpatory evidence. This man was in jail for 44 years before being released, and when he was released, he was 64 years old. There's no accountability for that evidence not being brought up earlier. It's strange because it was 14 years after the evidence was known before he was released, and that's the part that's just, to me, horrific. I mean, it just adds to it's like piling on bad stuff. If you know somebody, the evidence that you presented in a trial has all been thrown out, you should have that person released. And if you want to try him again, you should rearrest him after you have all the evidence. But you can't be tried twice for the same crime. But they get retry. In other words, if the court says you can retry this case, and it's your discretion, but there's no evidence, why should you keep him in jail?
What laws have changed since the time that Sandra Hemme was wrongfully convicted?
One of the things, it's not a law that I know of, but it may be in some state, decades is interview and interrogation techniques have changed. And there's people that teach that. And that's a department prerogative. In other words, your agency, your detective. But again, that goes to training. But it's not a law, it's just an interrogation technique. There should be some standards. Each state has what they call a post, police officers of standard training. They have minimum requirements. Investigation or interrogations, they should use, in other words, if each state adopted that, you would use the modern interrogation technique. You hear about these old cases, and some of them aren't that old, where they interrogate people for a day, a whole day. They don't let them sleep or anything. I mean, it's like people will confess to anything, and it's a public perception that why would somebody confess to something they didn't do? But if you were stressed to the point that you just wanted it to stop, and that's the Cliff Notes version of a false confession, you just want it to stop, so you confess to it and not understand the consequences. You're deprived of sleep, you're deprived of rest, hydration even, and yeah, you can confess. And even intelligent people can confess to something they didn't do. But you still need evidence in addition to the confession.
They were interrogating Sandra when she was in a hospital bed, when she was actually mentally being treated for something under a bunch of different medications, to my understanding.
In the Sandra case, did they mention anything about a signed confession? Is there a recording? And without a signed confession or a recording, how do you know what she confessed to?
Right.
There was a case where a 20-year-old was convicted of rape, and he was sentenced to jail, and DNA freed him. And in reading the summary of this particular incident, the police officers got a confession from this 20-year-old and took it to the prosecutor. And the prosecutor pointed out all the mistakes in the confession and said, go back and redo it. And that's what they did. The older confession technique is to give the defendant some of the information. Well, that's what they're confessing to, what you gave them. And that's what happened in the first time. You would think at a trial, if he had a competent attorney, would say, was this the first confession you did? Or was this the second? Or was it the third? And where's the first? I want that from the evidence. In other words, that's exculpatory evidence. That should be allowed at the trial. So yeah, I don't know that there are any laws that have changed. I just know that there's policy on training and training that has changed as far as the confessions go. Policy says every interrogation today should be filmed and recorded, whereas that didn't used to be at all. But just like the recent shooting, if your recorder's not on, we don't see it.
One in particular where a police officer was actually taking advantage of a female that was in the back of his car. I don't know if you heard about that one, but he ended up he was driving her, and the recorder was on, and she was getting kind of flirty with him, and they ended up, he got in the back of the car, and we're not sure at this time fully if he hooked up with her or not, but he was taking advantage of her, and he had turned off his camera, to my knowledge, and then he got locked in the back of the car. So he ended up having to call for backup. And they ended up investigating it, but they had to question the person in the back seat, the criminal, or the woman that was, arrested. And she said, yeah, this happened. And then they had to cross-check it with the camera.
Don't say that right now.
An officer caught red-handed in the backseat of his squad car with a woman he was supposed to be taking to jail. But that's not all. Investigators later found trace amounts of semen on his belt.
Alright, sir, step out of the vehicle for me.
This after she apparently made the officer a proposition for sex, and his body camera video mysteriously went dark.
Alright, sir, step out of the vehicle for me.
Body camera video captures Officer Hare's seemingly anxious reaction when he says everything went wrong. The other officer on the scene then stops recording almost right away.
Everything just went wrong. Okay, hold on, let me turn my camera off. She's code 4? She's code 4. Okay, let me turn this off real quick.
You'll notice from this video that Officer Hare isn't wearing his body camera when he's discovered in the back seat. He later told investigators it had somehow disconnected from the mount, but an internal affairs report determined that wasn't even possible. There's even video showing Hare's body camera still in good condition.
How you ended up inside.
So she was laying down, her face was over there. I don't know if I had my hand like this, and then something like that happened, and I kicked it with my foot like that, and then I was in, and then I was waking her up like this. I was like this, waking her up. While I was waking her up, I hear the door click behind me.
Other officers also speak with the female suspect, who recaps what happened from her perspective.
He was like, what did he say? Something like, he said, "Oh, are you single? Or are you with your boyfriend right there?" Or something like that.
So they had her confessing to, yeah, he was asking me if I wanted to hook up with him, and that's why he got locked in the back seat. So, and then they again, the camera ended up turning off, but she started getting real flirty. He said, "Don't say that while the camera's on." So it's kind of funny. Did you hear about that at all?
Yes. Police officers, for some reason, think they're immune from certain things that they're not. And when you put yourself in a position like that, then what happens when you go back and that person that you put yourself in a position with needs to be arrested? Now it's done in society all the time. Not just police work, it's, any government, any private industry, that kind of stuff, that happens.
Yeah.
But as a police officer, again, you need to put yourself above that. A lot of officers have lost their career because of women and alcohol. For some reason, they think they're immune from it.
Sometimes it's just not even a spur of the moment thing. It's like you were saying, like it could just be somebody that simply is irrational and does not belong in that position. For example, I've been wanting to talk about this. This is a great time. Where I live in San Luis Obispo County, California, we had a police officer here in my hometown that actually ended up taking advantage of a domestic violence victim. His name is Christopher McGuire. He went to respond to a situation where a woman was saying domestic violence against her boyfriend, and the officer ended up staying behind, and he was questioning her, and what ended up happening was he ended up hooking up with her. So talk about a police officer with bad credibility. This guy, Christopher McGuire, ended up beginning his police career in Porterville Police Department, which is another location nearby, in 2000. He didn't even make it out of his probationary period, and he was let go in 2001. Then he goes to another police department called Farmersville Police Department in 2003. Then he gets rehired in Porterville of 2007 and ends up leaving that job in 2012 for Paso Robles Police Department. However, a retired Porterville police sergeant ended up coming forward and saying that it was common knowledge that Christopher McGuire actually resigned from the Porterville Police Department following a rumor that he had had an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old at the time. And not just a random 15-year-old, this was a 15-year-old police academy explorer. Somebody that was in the program, just like Sandra Birchmore on the previous story that I covered on my channel. And when they ran his background check in Paso Robles, California, that did not come up. The allegation showed no record when they ran his background check. This guy actually ended up shooting an unarmed man following a physical confrontation in Porterville back in 2009. Somehow, he ended up still being cleared by the departmental panel. So let's go back to the event that he was being accused out here in Paso Robles, California for sexual assault allegations. This was back in 2018. Well, that hookup, not a hookup, not consensual. It was under intimidation. You know, our district attorney will recommend that victims of this kind of thing should come forward and say something, but in game, they didn't even press charges against him. And let me just give you an idea on what actually happened with this guy and the victim. After arriving at the home and interviewing the woman, after they arrested her boyfriend on suspicion of rape and false imprisonment, this guy, Christopher McGuire, is alleged to have teased her sexually. As she was very distraught, he ordered her to walk over to him and place her hand on his genitals through his pants, which he was turned on by. He said, "You like that, don't you? You like men of power." And then he actually compared his downstairs parts to his firearm. He told her to keep both hands on both guns, and he asked her, "Which gun do you like better?" She remembered that the assault lasted for 12 minutes. And after that, he continued to harass her, stalk her, and force her into this around town. In trade, he told her that he would ensure that her boyfriend would never hurt her again, and he would personally occasionally perform additional patrol checks of her home. When she finally had the courage to tell Christopher McGuire that enough was enough and she was not having this in her life anymore, he used every woman's worst fear, abusing leadership and power, telling her that I will have your children removed by Child Protective Services if you ever tell anybody about what happened here. Before he gave his resignation, pending allegations, he was actually placed on administrative leave from Paso Robles Police Department. And this guy was paid almost 41 grand while he was on leave. He had that notable history of bouncing around different departments. What really gets me is that it was the, quote, common knowledge, unquote, that he had been hooking up with a 15-year-old. I just wonder if action had been taken sooner before he ended up resigning and it went this far. Obviously, this is something that could have been prevented. Now, mind you, the DA out here in San Luis Obispo County, this is the same place that they picked up my domestic violence case, and they took that case on, which I'm forever grateful for. But it makes me wonder because my ex was not involved in law enforcement. My ex had a criminal history with another female in Tulare County of California. And out there, they picked up her case too. But you're looking at a police officer that had criminal history and bad behavior, and nothing was done about it. It just makes you wonder.
An update now to a story we've been following out of Paso Robles. A police sergeant accused of sexual assault has resigned. Police Chief Ty Lewis confirmed to us last night that Sergeant Christopher McGuire submitted his resignation and is no longer with the department.
That may be one of those cases where they said to him, we're going to charge you if you stay on the job. And then he resigns, and then it's not on his record. Now it's on the civil side. They want to get rid of their bad apples as efficiently as they can, not understanding there's consequences of not following through.
Well, even if he resigns, can't that catch up with him later?
Civilly it did, yeah, but it should be on his official police record also. Like I say, many departments are reluctant to charge their own officers, so they allow them to leave, and they shouldn't do that. They should say, in fact, the state police that I work for, they had a guy retire before he could be charged, and they changed the retirement system, whereas if you're being investigated, you can't retire until the investigation's complete and it's the whole disposition's done.
Now that I agree with, yeah.
Yeah, it's just so common because it's easier to let the person walk out the door and just write it off. It takes effort to pursue the charges and the conduct charges.
Yeah.
And that's what they need to do. And like we talked about earlier, there's indicators that you shouldn't be surprised when this happens because of what the past behavior. And it's just not taken care of. There's no administration or supervision that takes care of those issues. They want to leave it go.
Is there any examples that you can give us regarding your experience in the police force and as somebody that was an FBI instructor? Can you give us any examples of your best day, your worst day in being in this line of work? Is there anything that you could tell someone that would be interested in getting in this line of work, in this field?
I'm often asked that, like, aren't you glad you're not a police officer anymore? And my response is that I could probably not operate the police car because it's all computerized and everything else. It's not like it was when I had radios and stuff like that. But police work is the same today as it was 30, 40, 50, 60, even 100 years ago. It's a matter of interaction of one-on-one. You with the victim or you with the offender or witness. And I can tell you some of the best memories, you might say, are when people would write a letter to the barrack or the barrack commander thanking your behavior. It's oftentimes for something very small and minor, but it tells you how important it was for them if you helped them change a flat tire. I remember one time I stopped for a car that had a flat tire and the lugs were on so tight it couldn't work. And what I did is I took a block of wood out of my trunk and put it under the tire jack and just told the person just to drive forward just a few inches. And that broke each lug as we did that. And they wrote a super nice letter, and I had a number of things like that for something minor. I arrested well over 1,000 people, testified in court hundreds of times, and I don't think I ever got a thank you letter for locking anybody up.
Yeah.
But at the same time, those little things that people see and hear are important to them. And it tells you that when you go out on a crime scene, let's say it's a mailbox damaged, in a rural area, and you think it's minor, to them it's important. Just like a minor accident. And I've heard of officers say, well, the insurance will fix it, don't worry about it. Well, that's not the way it works. To them it's important. And you should act like that, because it is. And that's your job, because that's the service you're offering the community. And if you can't offer the service, you shouldn't be here. I remember talking to a lady in a rural area. I always worked rural areas. And she didn't report a crime that occurred where something was stolen from her home. And now she wanted to report it. This was like 10 days after the fact or whatever. And I said, okay, and I took the report. And the detective sergeant at the barracks said, why didn't she report this to begin with? And I said, she had a monitor in her home and she knew how busy we were. And she said, I don't want to bother them with something minor. Well, the reason she called is because a neighbor told her who did it, and it was a local kid. You know, I arrested the kid, but I could see an officer saying, well, why didn't you report this to begin with? Well, that's not important. What's important is she's reporting it now. Because a lot of crimes go unreported. And it's later when you find out who it is, you say, I don't want to report it. That's all right. There's no time limit on when you can report a crime. You know, that say that it has to be reported that day, that moment. That I think when you treat people like that, when you treat them fair and you express sympathy for their problem, which is part of your job, like the sheriff said, that's service. That's what your job is. That you treat everybody the way you want your family members to be treated if they were in that situation. They like it. That's their experience with law enforcement. You can yell and scream or whatever, and there are certain officers out there, you know, when you go to them on a call, there's going to be a fight or something, because that's just the way they talk to people. It's a great career if you like it. I can honestly say for 42 years, I didn't have a half a dozen bad days. And not many people can say that. I'm extremely thankful for my choices that I made early in life where I ended up. There's just so many things in our system that could be looked at. And, you know, you need to fix the system. And it is a long process. It's not immediate. And we are a society that wants immediate results. Any reforms won't be immediate. It'll be a long-term, well thought out. It involves the prosecutors, the judges, the courts, the legal system, the legislative system, responsibility with authority in law enforcement, corrections, anything like that. If the answer is easy and it's simple and it's short, it probably won't work, best I can say.
Special thanks to our guest speaker today, Shannon Bohrer, a former FBI instructor and former Maryland State Police officer. My channel will leave the link down below for your copy of his experience and written book, Judicial Soup, and what it means for criminal justice reform. As always, loved ones, have a blessed week and stay safe. I'm Chelsea J.